prosecutors like yourself, career prosecutors, see a president, see people properly convicted of crimes get pardoned, what is their morale after something like this, especially if it looks like it's a pattern?
Yeah, when it looks like a pattern, Chuck, it can be pretty demoralizing. I can tell you from my own experience as a prosecutor, there are things you can control and things you can't control. You could work really, really hard on a case, a righteous case, a white-collar case, and a judge decides that that person ought not to go to jail. And it could be disappointing, but at least you feel that the process was fair because the judge did not have some underlying political motive or imperative. Here it's a little bit different because there seems to be an underlying political imperative. And from a prosecutor's standpoint, even though we understand there are some things we can't control, it's typically not coupled with a bad motive.
Do you see bad motive here?
I'm beginning to see bad motive here, and I don't like to speculate, but a pattern's emerging. I'm not the brightest guy in the world, Chuck, but there's a pattern emerging. And a number of the people that the president has pardoned or signaled that he might pardon seem to fit a certain pattern. I mean, you articulated it in the opening.
You know, there's something else he said today. I want to open it up to the panel here. This is the president on Rod Blagojevich on Air Force One, and he said this. There's another one that I'm thinking about pardoning, Rod Blagojevich, 18 years in jail for being stupid and saying things that every other politician, you know, that many other politicians say. Plenty of other politicians have said a lot worse, and it doesn't. He shouldn't have been put in jail. Ramesh, what do you make of this rationale?
Well, I think there is a kind of cynicism that shades into a kind of cheap, pseudo-sophistication where you say, oh, they're all crooks. And in fact, Blagojevich was significantly worse than most politicians are. And if it's true that our standards for corruption are too low, which is, I think, what he's basically arguing here, that is not an argument for a pardon for Blagojevich. It's an argument for enforcing the law against everybody else.
That's very too logical and rational. But Heidi, you can't help but look at this. It's like he's trying to essentially whataboutism the entire Mueller investigation.
He's trying to fuzz it up and create this image as well of the Justice Department as this deep state well of corruption that is out to get people like him as well, who are ideologically similar to him in the case of Dinesh D'Souza. But you itemized also the specific crimes, which is really interesting when you draw a line between all of these individuals. In the case of Dinesh D'Souza, for instance, I was looking at this before I came in, making false statements, wire fraud, conspiracy. Who does that sound like?
I believe his name is Michael Cohen.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So again, we can't say for certain, but we can point out the pattern. And I think that is what we need to do, is point out the pattern.
Shane, this is what the president said about Dinesh D'Souza. He said, what should have been a quick minor fine, like everybody else with the election stuff, what they did to him was horrible. For what it's worth, before I get you to talk on this, apparently the Justice Department was so cruel to Dinesh D'Souza that his ex-wife decided she wanted to write a letter to the judge, not because she thought they were being so cruel, because she feared they would be too lenient. And she writes, please accept this letter as my effort to correct the record Dinesh created by his false and misleading submissions to the court regarding me, the extent and nature of his criminal conduct, and my relationship with our daughter. He says, quote, I trust the court will carefully consider my letter and impose a fair, appropriate, and just sentence. She basically went out of her way to make sure the judge says, please, essentially, don't be light on this guy. That's how unfairly she thought he was treated.
Right, and that's coming from somebody pretty close to the events. I mean, what I find fascinating about what the president said in the justification, and he's done this in other cases of pardons too, he is holding himself out as the final arbiter of justice. Right. This is a recent case for which the person who's convicted has not demonstrated any public contrition or attempts to take responsibility for what he did, which is usually the requisite step in getting a pardon, and then there is quite a long process of review. The president's coming in here saying, no, I'm the decider, I'm fixing this, I'm fixing that, and in a way it reminds me of the campaign where he says, you know, I'm the only one who can fix the mess that we're in, and he's sort of maybe holding out these cases as miscarriages of justice, and now he's going to fix it.
TV.
Yeah, right. Like, there's a question too of how these cases are being brought to him. Donald Trump does not come into office with a list of people who he thinks have been unfairly treated, and I can't wait to pardon them.
In a perverted way, these are very creative trolls, these pardons. I don't know who is putting these in front of him, but they're very creative trolls. They spin up the right enemies for the president, and they somehow appease the right part of his base, right, Ramesh?
Look, he has pardoned 5 people, and 60% of his pardons have gone to conservative cause celebres: D'Souza, Joe Arpaio, and shoot, I just forgot.
Scooter Libby.
Oh, Scooter Libby, that's right. Yeah. Yes, and so, you know, look, there are lots of miscarriages of justice in this country. It seems hard to believe that so many of them would involve members of his political base.
Chuck Rosenberg, what's the unintended consequence of the president, essentially, he's being this arbiter? I thought Shane described it well. It's sort of like he's going to be the arbiter of fairness here. But if a president is saying that basically all the campaign finance laws in this country are meaningless, because that's kind of the argument he's making. They're not serious. They shouldn't be enforced with the same seriousness that, you know, defrauding somebody personally would be. What's the unintended consequence of that in the legal world?
Well, he's substituting his judgment for the judgment of lots and lots of people who know the substance of this much better than he does. Now, there's no argument about his pardon authority. It's unfettered. He can pardon whoever he wants. But taking a class of offenses, let's say it's campaign finance or bank robbery or tax evasion or whatever it might be, and saying that that shouldn't count is really an act of substituting his judgment for that of not just the rest of the executive branch, but also the legislative branch. So I think it's a dangerous path. He does have unfettered authority, but there was always a process at the Department of Justice to bring pardons before him, as Shane said, when the person seeking the pardon had shown contrition, and the pardon was therefore an act of grace and not an act of sort of political opportunism.
And in fact, Chuck, let me put up, we have here the 5 standards, essentially, for having a pardon considered were supposed to be your character and your conduct and your reputation, assuming you're actually trying to improve that. I guess Dinesh D'Souza's Twitter feed would tell you otherwise. Seriousness and relative recentness of the offense, acceptance of responsibility, remorse and atonement, need for relief for some reason, and some sort of official recommendation perhaps from others. I mean, obviously, this did not go through any traditional Department of Justice protocol, correct?
That seems that way, Chuck, but these are policies, right? And the policies were put in place not to restrain the president, because everyone understands, as I said earlier, that the power here is unfettered, but to protect the president, to make sure that when he acts in a graceful way, when he confers a pardon or a commutation, it's to those people who really, really, truly deserve it and have proved that over time. And so these are policies that are there for a reason. They've stood... You know, they stood the test of time. They've worked well. He has just simply chosen to ignore them.
We assume the other thing that there may be an audience, and this is for the panel, of 3 or 4 people here, perhaps in these pardons. Michael Cohen, you've brought him up once. We know 4 people potentially who haven't been interviewed by Mueller, but potentially might be targets. Roger Stone, Michael Cohen, you have Brad Parscale and his son, Donald Trump Jr.
Right.
He seems to be telegraphing, at least perhaps to Cohen, and Stone.
Sure. I mean, and we've seen this even in the earlier pardons, too, and you've, like, neatly lined up how the offenses that he's pardoning are lining up with the offenses people have either been charged with or...
It's so ham-handed and transparent, it feels...
Right, of course. I mean,
like...
It's conditioning it, but you know, and getting the public ready for it. But I think it is, you know, pretty clearly also sending a message. That said, I cannot imagine that the attorneys for any of these people are betting their strategy and their future liberty on this.
And he has plausible deniability, bigly, he would say, that this is what he's doing. But it's part of a broader, put it in a broader category here, a broader tab, a broader file of yet another tentacle, another way of trying to undermine this investigation.
Ramesh, I got to ask, where's the outrage? I'm on the right. Isn't there, like, where are the rule of law conservatives who are going, wait a minute, this is an abuse of the pardon power?
Well, I think the Arpaio pardon in particular was a terrible abuse of power, and there were conservatives, including my colleagues at National Review.
No doubt, right. I'm not saying you guys. I don't,
against it.
When I say this, I don't say this about basically National Review and Weekly Standard, who all tried to keep their principles. You know.
But what I think Trump is doing is trying to redefine our understanding of things like corruption. For him, corruption basically is opposition to him. Right? There's no standard, there's no neutral standard of justice. And when he talks about law and order, he's talking about his enemies, and they need to be held to account. His friends need to be rewarded.
Okay, I agree that that's all the case, that that's how he sees this. Where's the rest of the Republican leadership on this? Nobody else can actually believe that this is what it should be.
what I think you're going to see for the most part, you're going to see some people who will say, for example, with D'Souza, he's a popular figure among some segments of the right. Some people will cheer this. A lot of other people are just going to be quiet. They're just going to ride it out. They're going to talk about other issues.
If you spend 10 minutes on Dinesh D'Souza's Twitter feed, and I question why anybody would want to stand with that man's character. That's people make their judgments. Good luck to them. Chuck Rosenberg, thank you, sir, coming on, sharing your expertise.